Hey there, so this video is going to give you 5 signs you are not an INTP. Many people consider themselves to be an INTP, and for good reason. After all, many people are introverted, intuitive, thinking, and perceiving. However, these MBTI dichotomies only really have a small overlap with a person's actual cognitive functions. Therefore, even if you consistently receive an INTP test result, it doesn't necessarily mean you have the INTP's respective cognitive functions. And it is these cognitive functions we're going to be focusing on in this video, but we're going to be going a little bit deeper. Many people will relate to the INTP on the basis of having an introverted thinking dominant function. They'll take one look at the words maybe introverted thinking or a particularly basic description of the function and relate to it on the basis of thinking a lot, preferring logic over emotions, having opinions. The ability to internalize logic does not automatically make you an INTP. I mean, if being able to think was a qualifying factor here, there'd be very little point in making this video. So in keeping with the established tradition of my 5 signs series, we're going to be starting by defining the real difference between introversion and extroversion. However, for those of you who have already seen the other videos in this series, you may want to consider skipping ahead to the next chapter. The INTP is a cognitive introvert, and here it is very important to distinguish between introversion as it is commonly portrayed and cognitive introversion. What does this mean? Well, the INTP tends to be more cognitively proactive than they are reactive. That is to say, an internal dialogue takes precedence over that external. While an extroverted cognition will oftentimes find themselves completely engaged with meaningful external activity, be it going down a rabbit hole of research or learning a skill, the INTP tends to find this activity fueling an internal dialogue, whereby they cross-reference what they are externally perceiving or pursuing against their primary locus of control, that is, internal frameworking. Now, it is worth mentioning introverted thinking dominants in general tend to employ extroverted thinking as a natural extension of an introverted thinking dialogue. Cognition here does remain proactive, but there is a tendency to outsource to a smaller degree of reactive cognition as a natural extension of an introverted thinking proactivity. And if you are interested in exploring this more cognitive approach to introversion and extroversion, I highly recommend checking out this video over here. As such, if you only ever find yourself most engaged and fulfilled when bouncing off external mediums, and may even feel restless after half an hour in your own headspace, it is pretty unlikely you are an INTP. The INTP experiences a strong compulsion towards internal dialogue, and as much as they may enjoy tweaking and researching external parameters, this is seldom done absent an extensive internal dialogue. Sign number 2 that you are not an INTP. The INTP is an introverted thinking dominant. So the implications of being a TI dominant here are threefold. First and foremost, as a primary gateway to the psyche, vivid internal frameworking is pretty much compulsory. Seriously, this isn't something you can just turn on and off, but rather something that tends to be an ongoing constant within an INTP's cognition. But there is more to introverted thinking than just, thinking. Thought is something we all do in one form or another, but introverted thinking refers to a very specific form of thought. That is to say, everybody thinks, but not everybody is constantly adding to and adjusting highly opaque parameters of operation. And with introverted sensing acting as this function's auxiliary, and you can think of this as the internal microscope through which introverted thinking is being perceived, the INTP spends a lot of time incrementally adjusting objective values within their own frameworks. Secondly, introverted thinking in a dominant position very naturally outsources to extroverted thinking. Unlike the ISFJs and INFJs, who tend to experience introverted thinking in more of a kind of vacuum, the INTP, and indeed ISTP, tend to much more naturally extend into extroverted thinking to essentially cross-reference internal parameters against those external. And also extroverted thinking here tends to expand the INTP's curiosity, and as such you have someone not only interested in philosophical and existential matters, but also very interested in mechanisms and systems as well. And as such, if you find your introverted thinking musings limited almost exclusively to psychology, philosophy, morality, it's less likely you are an INTP, because as much as these subjects may even serve as a very cornerstone of an INTP's frameworks, the curiosity of the introverted thinking dominant tends to encapsulate all. Playing a video game, for example, the INTP would not just want to lose themselves in a narrative, but also begin to experiment upon the very mechanics of the gameplay, oftentimes developing their own individualized playstyle in the process. And leading on from that point, introverted thinking in the dominant position is predominantly convergent. This lends the introverted thinking of the INTP a high degree of fluidity as they are incrementally adjusting and adding to their frameworks over time, but it also instills in the function a certain egoistic creativity as well. Here, conclusions are actively valued by the ego, and individuality is realized through the exploration of and subsequent innovation upon an internalized sense of objective truth. If you find yourself only dipping into such vivid internal thoughts sporadically, doing so in a more loose manner, absent intention to integrate all that is known into a highly tailored internal map of reality, it is pretty unlikely you are an INTP. Furthermore, if you experience very little in the way of egoistic satisfaction upon reaching your conclusions, perhaps even preferring to simply let the evidence speak for itself, devoid of any kind of theoretical explanation alongside it, it is pretty unlikely you are an INTP. Sign number 3 that you are not an INTP, the introverted thinking, introverted feeling dip. The conclusions of the INTP are not just egoistically valued owing to their convergence. Just as introverted thinking is convergent within this type, the introverted feeling realm is much more divergent. What does this mean? Well, as fluid and open-ended as the logic of the INTP tends to be, the emotional matter driving their conclusions can sometimes be a little bit more on the stubborn side. Now, contrary to popular stereotype, the INTP is not some kind of cybernetic organism. In fact, this type tends to have emotional depths that go unnoticed by or even unappreciated by other people. However, as much as emotions are very much a constant within this type, vivid conscious awareness of them beyond, say, a sense impression is not. This is because of the volitional nature of a dip function. Essentially, introverted feeling must be voluntarily dipped into in order to be effectively explored, which can prove problematic for those INTPs unwilling to do so. And in extreme cases, this can manifest as a cognitive bias under the masquerade of detached objectivity. A particularly unhealthy INTP would be perfectly aware of their internal frameworks, but somewhat oblivious to the introverted feeling, rendering these frameworks, well, not so objective in the first place. This can ensue a certain catch-22 scenario whereby the continued reliance upon introverted thinking effectively blinds the type to the influence of introverted feeling. Thankfully, should such a loop be pointed out to the INTP in the form of, say, a logically coherent argument, the INTP can swiftly adjust their frameworks accordingly. The TI dominant prioritizes the integrity of their frameworks and ultimately their ability to reach reliable conclusions. Should such a cognitive bias be pointed out to the type, they are generally able to stamp it out quickly and punitively. A mature INTP happily engages this introverted feeling dip, valuing as they do the reconciliation of objectivity and subjectivity, and such an individual tends to be an incredibly empathetic and moral human being. However, while the cold robot stereotype is most certainly a myth here, the volitional nature of introverted feeling is not. And as such, if you find conscious awareness of the emotions driving your conclusions, the bridge between personal identity and objective internal framework to be an ongoing constant, it is pretty unlikely you are an INTP. In contrast to the attached logical style of, say, the INFP, the logical style of the INTP is much more detached by nature, and they must voluntarily dip down into introverted feeling in order to consult their values, identity, and driving emotions, effectively serving as a reference point for where the self ends and objectivity begins. Sign number 4 that you are not an INTP, the extroverted intuitive authority function. Now, as much as the INTP may enjoy a sense of internal precision, this introverted sensing internal microscope is effectively counterbalanced by the reign of the type's extroverted intuitive authority function. This open-ended perception of external reality tends to make the INTP perpetually conscious of what-ifs, and this does instill in the type a need to take myriad perspectives in pursuit of a single definitive solution. That is to say, the introverted sensing microscope of the INTP must generally be used from multiple different perspectives until the INTP is confident in the integrity of their frameworks. Now, here's the caveat. Operating underneath this extroverted intuitive authority function is an equally divergent introverted intuition. As such, not only must the INTP entertain myriad different perspectives, but there tends to ensue a constant firing of novel ideas and connections to be entertained sequentially underneath the type's internal microscope. With the INTP's primary lens being instead introverted sensing, much convergent energies are instead directed towards close examination and refinement of the individual building blocks in question. However, it would be a lie to say the INTP must entertain every single internal value of such a high degree of scrutiny. I mean, that would be exhausting. No, the INTP tends to fall down into a much more murky, introverted, intuitive, introverted, thinking dormant state, whereby they can rely upon the general principles connecting all of these components together. As such, if you feel very little compulsion in the way of an underlying what-if factor, and you can easily entertain one possibility without being confronted by a swarm of other ones, it is pretty unlikely you are an INTP. As precise as the INTP tends to be in introverted thinking analysis, they invariably feel pulled back towards a world of infinite perspectives and possibilities. Sign number 5 that you are not an INTP, the extroverted feeling, oppositional function. Extroverted feeling is often mistaken for a weak function within this type, which I think is a little unfair. The INTP tends to be a very naturally adept networker and observer of people. Being naturally divergent here, this extroverted feeling oppositional function is actually quite adept at observing the social world around oneself. And despite the INTP's detached logical style, on the whole they do tend to be quite sensitive to social feedback in general. And assigned as it is here to a predictive, extroverted, intuitive lens, this type tends to be quite naturally attuned to social contingency. And it is not unusual in the slightest bit for an INTP at quite an early age to develop quite an in-depth understanding of social transactions in general. And it is not unusual for a more confident and outgoing INTP to have extensive social circles as well. And as such, contrary to stereotypes, if you feel limited in your natural social abilities, and even feel oblivious oftentimes to the social transactions occurring in the world around you, it is less likely you are an INTP. That being said, effective employment of extroverted feeling in its oppositional position tends to be extremely draining for this type, and it is not unusual after a short conservative burst of extroverted feeling energies, let's say, for the type to retreat entirely into an introverted thinking sanctum. And this can even come across to observers as a kind of social bipolarity. And this precarious relationship with the function in question can lead to a degree of extroverted feeling ambivalence, and even a tendency to prefer social circles where extroverted feeling employment is not only unnecessary, but also unwarranted. And in these circumstances, there can be a tendency to let go of extroverted feeling altogether, bouncing ideas and opinions without having to worry about social consequences. However, this ambivalence can be something of a double-edged sword for this type, as even in the most trusted and open of social circles, a degree of extroverted feeling employment is still necessary. And there can be occasions whereby an INTP, coupled with their sensitivity to social feedback in the first place, can be taken completely off guard by an unforeseen reaction of a close friend. It is, ironically, in these circumstances where the INTP completely lets go of extroverted feeling that they can become most vulnerable to social consequences. And it is not unusual for an INTP to henceforth take their non-extroverted feeling activating socializing to entirely virtual domains. Indeed, perhaps owing to the anonymity factor, some INTPs, although certainly not all INTPs, may even experience a certain level of detached satisfaction in adopting a more playful or even mischievous communication style on the internet than they would in real life. If you feel you have a completely secure relationship with extroverted feeling and have noticed very little tendency for your social battery to become easily drained, it is less likely you are an INTP. Furthermore, upon your social battery being drained, you notice very little tendency to retreat into a much more detached and externally even cold introverted thinking sanctum, it is again less likely you are an INTP. As proficient as this type can be with this function, it is still oppositional to the ego, and as such all but the most individuated INTP will still experience a degree of ambivalence in their relationship with their extroverted feeling oppositional function. Sometimes even feeling like the sway of extroverted feeling is something they must actively escape from. Bonus point, the INTP has an extroverted sensing blind spot, with the primary external lens of the INTP being extroverted intuition. Concrete experience of extroverted sensing reality tends to fall slightly by the wayside. This tends to result in a level of disconnect from the here and now, as the attention of sensing as a whole is drawn inwardly towards the type's introverted sensing microscope. Now, it isn't that extroverted sensing is necessarily unvalued by this type. With this function still being convergent, the INTP can still oftentimes happily go out of the way in order to create valuable concrete experience for both themselves and other people. However, in terms of the conscious observation of this function, this type does tend to feel disconnected from tangible external experience, with the extroverted intuitive authority function reigning supreme. However, this disconnect from extroverted sensing does come with its advantages, as for as long as the INTP's opposing functions are healthy, the INTP is very naturally adept at predicting external causality, tending to live much more in the then than the now. As such, if you feel a strong attachment to intense concrete experience, maybe even finding yourself getting carried away in the moment with a little compulsion to take a step back and predict the chain of events in question, it is quite unlikely you are an INTP. Now granted, a particularly extroverted feeling suppressed INTP may find themselves a little bit blind on a social anticipation front, but these do tend to be the exception more than the norm. Furthermore, if your attachment to concrete experience is so strong as to find the meaningful moment wholly reinvigorating and inspiring, it is again unlikely you have an extroverted sensing blind spot. And that concludes the video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it's been informative, and if you haven't already done so, I highly recommend subscribing to the channel. If you did find the video useful on some level, be sure to let me know by clicking the like button below, and if you know of anyone or any communities even who you think might benefit from the contents of this video, be sure to share it with them as well. If you are interested in delving further into the fundamentals behind CPT, I recommend checking out the CPT ebook, and if you yourself are interested in what type you might be, or just like to know about how your type might apply specifically to you as an individual, I highly recommend checking out the CPT type service. And finally, CPT is also on Patreon, so if you would like to support the channel and the theory on that additional level, it'd be absolutely amazing to see you there. I do a live stream over there every month, and we also have our very own dedicated Patreon-only Discord server too. So that is it from me, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks. For now, take care.